Joined on the phone today by author Ivor Davis. How are you today, sir?
I'm terrific, Dustin, and I hope you're well as well.
I am well, and it's great to talk to you again. I know it's been almost a year exactly since we've had John last, and I want to ask you about the book, The Beatles and Me on Tour. Has that been selling pretty well?
It's been selling very well. I was over in England and Ireland last month, and they were quite excited about it, but it's doing well, and I'm still talking about the Beatles because everybody wants to know about the Beatles. I'm going to a Beatles convention in a few days in Chicago, and it's a new life for me.
Yeah, definitely very cool. And I want to ask you maybe just briefly, if some of the listeners out there maybe missed you the first time around, how did you wind up with the Beatles on that first tour back in '64?
Well, I was a lucky guy, and very briefly, here's what happened. I was a foreign correspondent in Los Angeles for the London Daily Express, which was a big newspaper with 4 million readers a day. My editor called me from London and said, get on a plane to San Francisco. The Beatles are in town. I want you to travel with them, eat with them, drink with them, write George Harrison's column, and tell Europe and tell England how the Beatles are going over in America. So I took off not knowing what to expect, and when I arrived, it became an incredible ride, and boy, did the Beatles conquer America 50 years ago.
Yeah, and of course, we're coming up on the 50th anniversary of actually when the Beatles met Elvis, so that's the other guy you could probably say that has had as much impact, as the Beatles have. What are your memories of that meeting when that happened?
Well, the interesting thing is that for a year, Colonel Tom Parker, who was Elvis's mentor and his manager, and Brian Epstein, who was the Beatles' manager, were talking for over a year to try and get the boys together, but it never happened in 1964. But this year is 50th anniversary of when the Beatles did get together with Elvis, and we got a call in Beverly Hills one day, and Brian said to me, we're going to see Elvis. So we all jumped into the limos, and off we went to Elvis Presley, because the Beatles were great fans of Elvis. They grew up on Heartbreak Hotel and blue suede shoes, and they always wanted to meet him. So when we got to the house in Beverly Hills, which was owned by Elvis, although he, of course, had Graceland in Memphis, Elvis was there, and I thought it would be a wondrous get-together. But for the first half an hour, they sort of sat around not saying anything. It was kind of awkward. Nobody introduced the Beatles to Elvis until Paul jumped up and said, hi, I'm Paul. And the rest of the lads followed, and the ice was slightly broken, but still it was very sort of uncool. And then all of a sudden Elvis jumped up, and Elvis was looking like Elvis with his bouffant hairstyle, his bright shirts and sunglasses at 10 o'clock at night. And he said to the Beatles, well, I'm going to bed. And the Beatles said, and he said, well, unless you guys came here to jam, and that was kind of the signal that broke the ice. The Beatles got guitars. Elvis got a guitar, and for about 30 minutes, they just jammed playing a variety of songs, and that broke the ice. But the interesting thing, Dustin, is that after that terrific meeting where there were no pictures, there were no interviews, there was nothing except for us eyewitnesses, after that meeting, the Beatles and Elvis kind of fell out. And the reason was that Elvis went to the White House to see Richard Nixon, and he badmouthed the Beatles. And Elvis went there with a mission because he wanted to get a Drug Enforcement Agency honorary badge. So he would say anything. The interesting thing is, and I hope I'm not rambling on too much, the interesting thing was I heard from David Stanley, who was Elvis's half-brother, that when Elvis went to the White House in 1970 to see President Nixon, he was stoned out of his mind. And so much so that he took a couple of guns into the White House and presented them to Nixon with nobody knowing he was carrying guns under his shawl. Anyway, cut a long story short, after Elvis made those remarks about the Beatles were royally annoyed, not surprisingly, and they didn't like him. And then a year later, Elvis said the same thing, badmouthed the Beatles to J. Edgar Hoover. So by that time, Beatles and Elvis were not really friends, and that was the problem. I should add one more thing, Dustin, and that was by the time I went to the meeting with Elvis and the Beatles, I realized, not then, but much later, that Elvis was jealous of the Beatles because what had happened was they'd knocked him off the number one spot of the hit parade, and number two, they'd made one movie, A Hard Day's Night, and it was a smash hit, and Elvis churned out 3 rotten movies a year. So he was a bit jealous, and he was a bit upset, and that may have explained why, when we all arrived at Elvis's place, Elvis was a little bit cool to start with.
Yeah, it does seem around that time Elvis kind of was, I don't know if you'd say he was down in his career, but definitely leaner years. So could you sense that Elvis, was he kind of off-puttish to the Beatles, and maybe they were kind of just, kind of fanboys in a way, and he was annoyed by that?
I mean, if I come to your house, and you've invited me to your house, Dustin, and I show up and you stay in your seat, you don't bother to come up and welcome me, that isn't too wonderful, is it? I mean, you would, if I came to your house, I'm sure you'd come up and greet me warmly and invite me to have a drink or whatever. But it didn't happen with Elvis. And I think there was a sort of a simmering resentment by Elvis, because he was no longer the kingpin. He was the king, of course, but not top of the heap. And the Beatles were top of the heap. And there was a certain element of jealousy. And as I mentioned a moment ago, Elvis was, he didn't like doing 3 movies a year, the same story with slightly different music. So he was trapped in this slave labor film contract, and the Beatles were riding high, and he wasn't.
Yeah, it definitely would have been interesting to see how that meeting would have went if he was maybe in a better place. Again, we're on the phone today with Ivor Davis. He's the author of the book The Beatles and Me on Tour, and talking about the day the Beatles met Elvis about 50 years ago. And you mentioned some music being played, and they had like a no photo, no recording policy. But can you imagine if some of that would have been recorded and maybe released?
Oh, my God. That is why I am still, to this very day, stunned. It was really, I think, a combination of Brian Epstein and Tom Parker who said we didn't want any publicity, which was kind of ludicrous. I mean, Brian actually wrote a note saying the boys didn't want to be excited by visiting Elvis, and so they should not invite any newspaper people or any photographers. But what a difference it would have been if somebody had been there to record the pictures and to even talk to the Beatles and Elvis. It could have been a movie, but they didn't. And as I said, well, the other thing I should mention, Dustin, is that if you remember, Elvis was never Mr. Gregarious. Elvis was not a Mr. Personality with people he didn't know. In fact, even at the top of his career, he was very shy, and that's why he surrounded himself with the Memphis Mafia, his schoolmates, his buddies. He felt comfortable. And Elvis couldn't make small talk conversation. The Beatles, on the other hand, were gregarious, funny, off the cuff funny. They could improvise anywhere, anytime, any hour. And Elvis wasn't the same kind of guy. Elvis was Mr. Shy, strangely enough, even though he got up on stage and gyrated, much to the chagrin of some people.
I got to imagine if some of that was recorded, even just the audio of the two of them maybe talking in a room someplace probably would have sold millions of copies these days.
I mean, that would have been, somebody would have packaged that, conversations around their music, Elvis hits, Beatle hits. It could have been a sensational record. Nobody did it. I didn't take a tape recorder, although I had a tape recorder at the time. They didn't, and I always kid, I wish I'd taken my iPhone camera with me. But of course, as we all know, the iPhone was still to be invented.
Yeah, definitely a different time for sure. You mentioned they kind of had a falling out, but before that, do you know if there was ever any discussion of the two working together or anything like that?
There was never a discussion, to my knowledge, of them working together. What happened in the conversations that I overheard at the house 50 years ago this summer was that, John was a little bit of a provocateur, and he and Paul said to Elvis, Elvis, why aren't you making the kind of music you used to make? Well, the reason was he was making all these movies. But I think that kind of upset Elvis a bit, because the implication was that Elvis was no longer making good music, and Elvis knew he wasn't. He was making these movies. So I think that also may have helped to turn the atmosphere at the beginning into somewhat more hostile than it should have been. So that was their conversation. When they got onto subjects about flying, the perils of flying around, they were on more safer ground, if you know what I mean. But certainly when Paul and John said, Elvis, we love your old stuff, that certainly gave the message to Elvis that he wasn't what he thought he was, and he should be on his game, and he wasn't on his game. All the sort of psychological insights that we can now interpret that meeting with.
Yeah, for sure. And it's kind of odd to think, a lot of people say you shouldn't meet your heroes because you might be disappointed by them. It's weird to think that even somebody as iconic as the Beatles would have something like that happen to them.
Well, yes, but don't forget, they admired Elvis. John told me when he was a few years younger, he used to listen to Elvis's records in the middle of the night on the only radio station called Radio Luxembourg in Europe that broadcast into England. So John was weaned on Elvis music, and so they admired his early stuff, and like they admired Bob Dylan, who was another fan of theirs, and they were a fan of his. But the difference between Elvis and Bob Dylan was that Bob Dylan, after Bob Dylan met the Beatles, they kept in touch, and Bob Dylan went to England, stayed with John Lennon, and they got on with each other, and they were friends. But after that one meeting 50 years ago this summer, and the Beatles never got together again.
Well, you mentioned being in there and kind of sensing that Elvis maybe knew that they were passing him by, but 50 years later, you could argue still the Beatles and Elvis are probably the two biggest bands ever. But could you sense that day in that hotel room that the Beatles were passing Elvis by?
Well, it wasn't so much that, but the trouble with the pop music world is, today's big story is old stuff the next day, and the same goes for music. If you're top of the hit parade 1 week or 1 month or 1 year, and then suddenly you disappear from the hit and somebody else takes over, you're yesterday's news, you're old bread. So in retrospect, that, as I said, might have explained the underground tension that I felt in the Elvis house on that night we went along. And so I guess you could explain why nobody actually introduced the Beatles to Elvis until Paul did. Paul introduced himself, and then the Beatles introduced themselves. But it was a sort of not an outward sign of tension, but it was there. And finally, it was either going to be a total disaster, or they had to meet on common ground, and they did meet on the common ground of getting guitars, playing music. Like any other garage band, they jammed.
Yeah, definitely a fascinating story for sure. And we were talking a bit off air, Ivor. I know that the Beatles, and that's just kind of a fraction of a lot of the stuff that you've covered in your life. So is there something coming up next? Are you working on another new book or anything like that?
Well, I am. I've had great success with the Beatles book, and somebody has asked me if I could talk about and write about some of the other celebrities that I've met and interviewed over a 50-year career, and I will. And in fact, off the air, you and I were talking about your wonderful interview that you did a few weeks ago with the former heavyweight champion of the world, George Foreman, and our conversation went along the lines, and you put it so succinctly that George, when he was a heavyweight boxer, was a little bit of a brute. He was uncommunicative, he was unfriendly, and then all of a sudden he was transformed into this teddy bear. And I think you got a bit of the teddy bear when you did your interview, which I found fascinating, because as I said, when I interviewed him, he kind of grunted during his boxing days, and I got a picture of him lying down on the floor and me standing over him, believe it or not. But he wasn't the nicest guy, and then all of a sudden he became a personality. He'd finished his boxing career. He had a television series. But it's interesting. So I'm rather a long-winded answer to your question, Dustin. But yeah, I interviewed Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton, Muhammad Ali, and about dozens of others, and have funny stories to tell about them. And I hope to tell about them maybe in my next book. Thank you for asking.
Yeah, definitely. And I look forward to reading that. And again, Ivor Davis, I really appreciate you being on with me today. It's been great.
Thanks for having me, Dustin. Bye-bye.
Again, that was Ivor Davis, author of the book The Beatles and Me on Tour. You can find more information at his website, ivordavisbeatles.com. That's IVOR Davisbeatles.com.